I'm Benjamin Hall, and I'm searching for heroes. Well, thanks again for joining us, everybody. And, well, we've got a guest on today who has been somewhere that none of us have been, and that is to space. My guest today is Scott Kelly, and he's an astronaut. He has spent more time in space in one go than anyone else. He spent a whole year in space, and I'm just fascinated by, A, what drives an astronaut? How do they think of the world in general? You know, are they scientists, philosophers? What do they do? But he is someone who has done amazing things. He's the son of police officers. He has a degree in marine engineering. He became a pilot, was at the US Naval Postgraduate School, and he has always said that he just wanted to keep doing more and more, find the hardest thing. So he flew 3 shuttle missions, then did his year in space. And today he does amazing things still. And, you know, he's been in Ukraine. He's trying to help and raise money out there. And I think our conversation today is really fascinating, both about what he's done, but also about the world in general and about resilience. So thank you again for joining me. And, well, I hope you enjoy today. When you went into being an astronaut, when you started, did you understand the different complexities, or did you just think, I'm a pilot, I'm going to space, I'm going to do science? Or did you think there was something much bigger to it?
You know, I thought mostly that, my motivation was more from the perspective of being a pilot and a test pilot. My interest in flying for NASA as an astronaut was more about flying the space shuttle, which because at the time, and still is really, I think, the most complicated aerospace vehicle ever built. Which, my understanding was it would be the most challenging to fly, and that's what I was looking for, and I was correct. So that was my prime motivator. The other things about, seeing the Earth from space and no borders and no, looking at the fragility of the planet and the environment, that kind of stuff is something for me that kind of just came later and was natural just fallout of having this opportunity and this privilege. So it wasn't a motivator for me.
Because I suppose all astronauts have to go through sort of psychological screening to, obviously to make sure that they are the right mind frame when they go up there. Do you think that's something they look for as well? Someone who's not going to be distracted by the bigger picture or what it means to be up there? Because surely that would distract a great astronaut from the work they have to do.
I don't know. I do know that NASA, during NASA's selection, and I would assume that the other agencies do something similar, the other space agencies, is that we do have a psychological screening process. For me, when I interviewed in 1995, we took 2 written tests. 2 written tests were part of that. I thought they were both psychological tests. I learned later that one of them was actually an IQ test. So I don't know if you fail it clearly I didn't fail, but it was an IQ test. And you also talk to some psychologists, psychiatrists, like a team of mental health professionals before you're selected. What kind of criteria are they looking for? I'm not sure, but I would imagine, things like, are you a psychopath? Are
you passed that one?
Yeah. Are you a narcissist? Can you work well with others? Those kind of things. Whether they screen for, will you be distracted by the big picture? I think you kind of get, or by the enormity of what you're doing, I think you kind of get that kind of screening in your own, whichever background you're coming from. Like me being in the Navy, clearly you have to be able to focus, flying airplanes off aircraft carriers and then coming back and landing them. Clearly you have to be the type of person that can focus in on, the stuff that's most important and avoid the distractions. Like you would imagine you'd have many of those kind of things in space.
I mean, you've talked quite often in other interviews about how throughout life you wanted to go and try and achieve the hardest thing possible. You always wanted to go and try and do more, do something. That's an incredible quality to have. And I suppose most astronauts have that. But where did you get that drive? And your brother has it too, like both of you. Was it background? Was it your education? You had a total commitment. You wanted to go out and do the toughest thing you could. What is that?
I think our parents weren't, the type of parents that would like hover over us and make us do our homework. They didn't micromanage their children, certainly not like I do or did. But they encouraged us that we could do anything if we dedicated ourselves to it, if we put our minds to it, if we never gave up. So growing up, there was always this sense that, if I want to make the commitment, if I want to learn what I need to learn, if I want to, put my effort into doing whatever that thing is, I can be successful. And that is, I think, one thing that my parents instilled in both my brother and I, that then I can think the fallout of that was always trying to do the next harder or challenging thing. Particularly when it came to flying airplanes, because that's kind of an easy thing to kind of understand how, certain airplanes just get progressively harder to fly. And that's why we wanted to fly off the ship. I could have easily just said, well, I'm going to be an Air Force pilot and, fly on off of a runway. A lot easier than, flying off the aircraft carrier. But both my brother and I wanted to do that because we recognized that would be the harder and more challenging thing to do. And quite honestly, if you're not choosing goals that you think you may not be able to accomplish, maybe that you think you might be a little bit short of, how do you really know where you're gonna, where your envelope of success is? If you're not picking things that you might fail at times, maybe you're just selling yourself short, right? So we always looked at, I think, goals and challenges that way. Find, the hard thing, work hard at it. Hopefully you're successful, but if you're not, maybe you've learned something, you take a step back, you reevaluate, and then you move forward.
Would you be someone who, if you didn't succeed in something, that drove you to try again and again until you succeeded?
Failure is an option, right? Despite of what you've seen in the movies, failure is definitely an option. And, sometimes things don't work out. You got to look at what other opportunities exist out there for you and move on. I would say I don't give up easy, right? I don't think I've ever given up, but, there are probably times when, things are just not going to happen despite all your efforts.
Do you get a sense, let's say look at the country in general, at the US, do you think that drive in kids, now you've done a fair amount of work in education as well. Do you think that's still there? Do you think it's missing a fair amount? Do you think, say, social media, people spend time on their phones, do you think that it's not there, or do you think it still is the way it used to be?
I can remember growing up and, there was you and your friends and you had a little TV maybe in your house and a radio. And you didn't have all the information in the world available in your pocket. And, you had to, you had to work hard, not only to learn things by going to the library, but you had to work hard to do things and get things. I always had this vision that I was going to do something in my life that was extraordinary. I didn't know what it was, but I just had this feeling I was going to do that, and this goal and this desire. And I remember, my brother was the same way. I remember a lot of my friends growing up had this fire inside of them that, they weren't sure what they were going to do, but they were going to do it and they were going to be successful. And I think I don't see that as much today. I mean, there was a poll, I think it was a year or so ago, that somebody asked me about, and it had to do with kids and what they aspire to be when they grow up. And the number one thing that kids want to be are social media influencers. Now, I'm a social media influencer a little bit, but I never had a goal to be a social media influencer, especially as a kid growing up. I wanted to be a doctor, a pilot, an engineer, whatever, right? Something real and meaningful. I think it's okay maybe to have that as a fallout, but for that to be your primary goal that you want to do in your life, you want to influence other people to buy shoes. I think we've lost, a certain amount of, energy and desire in young people today as a result of society and social media and stuff, I think.
That doesn't paint a great picture for the future. I mean, that doesn't say that we're heading in the right direction. And look, you work have done incredible things in a field where we are trying to advance and move forward and get to space and Mars and keep going. What happens if all we want to do is sell shoes on the internet? Like, are you afraid that there's a problem in the future? And what could we perhaps do to turn that around? Well,
yeah, there is. It is a problem. Social media influencer is not going to solve climate change or, the engineering and scientific challenges.
But is that at school or is it parents? Like, where does it begin to really get kids going?
I think it's all that, it's schools, it's teachers, it's parents, it's, making sure young kids don't have access to devices and social media. I was kind of in this transition period. My kids are probably the first generation of kids that will, especially my son, that will always have known about, cell phones and having these kind of devices. But I think it's critically important. We need STEM graduates in this country to do the work and solve the problems of the future. And there are a lot of those problems, and those, by and large, will be solved by scientists and engineers, not by social media influencers. Yeah. So we got a serious challenge ahead of us.
And I guess there are two sides to that coin, because of course some of the technology has made leaps and to move us forward, and at the same time it's also holding us back.
I remember my math teacher saying, because I was also the first, when I was in high school, that's when a calculator became a thing, right? Mm-hmm. And I remember the teacher saying, you're not always going to have that calculator in your pocket. Turns out she was wrong.
Yeah. I suppose there's something else you need to be an astronaut, and that is the ability to perhaps am I right in saying you would have to be able to put fear to one side? And I'm thinking to a story when there was a satellite, you were in space, a satellite hurtling towards you. The three of you had to get into the Soyuz, which was effectively your life raft. And you didn't know if that was going to hit you. You didn't know anything. And you just had to sit there and you had to wait. And I imagine that there's a mental strength that you needed to find there, where you didn't let that get over you. And you have that, right? And astronauts have that. And that, I think, is quite key in life. Would you say that you don't feel fear that way, or you were able to put it to one side when you have to?
Yeah. On the space station, there's a lot of bad things that can happen. You can get hit by orbital debris. You could have a fire. You could have a depressurization, ammonia leak. We have very concentrated ammonia that if it gets inside the space station, it could be deadly very quickly. And the odds of that happening in any given year are pretty high. It's like, I don't know, on the order of like 100, 200 to 1 or something. You never get on an airplane with those kind of odds. If you had like a 0.5% chance that the thing is going to die, no one would ever do that. So there's inherent risk involved, but it's not something you dwell on because you have no control over it. The situation you mentioned, we had a Russian satellite that was going to get within a half a mile of the space station. We didn't know how close. We went into the Soyuz to shelter in place, basically, in case the space station got hit. Maybe we could use it as a lifeboat and survive. And I can remember, as we're looking at our clocks, the clock's counting down towards the closest point of approach. And Misha's looking out the window and listening. And I said, "Oh, Misha, you're not gonna see anything. This thing's going 35,000 miles an hour relative to us. That's 20 times faster than a rifle bullet. Imagine trying to see something that's going 20 times faster than a bullet from a rifle." So I go, "You're not going to see anything, right?" And then I notice I'm looking out the window and I'm kind of tensing up and holding my breath, thinking that, oh, this is going to help. And I realized, if we got hit, that amount of energy and, the time it would have taken for any kind of, neural signal, whether it's sound or sight or pain, to to hit our brains, we would have been vaporized before that ever happened. So, there's certain times in your life where you just got to well, this is completely out of my control, and just brace for impact. And that's kind of one of them. And I think you have to have sort of that mindset. So,
yeah, I was in Libya once, and we were in this port. We were being shelled left and right, and there was nowhere to go to, nowhere to run. And we just sat there for a couple of hours, and we just thought, it's either going to hit us or it's not. And what do you do? Do you panic in there, or do you just keep doing your work and you keep writing and you keep doing things? And I remember that ability to say, to stop, to say, all right, that's not going to help. So let's just keep doing something else. But you said that it wasn't going to really affect you because, the brain happened so quickly, but must have thought that it was going to affect your family. Those thoughts must cross your mind. Yeah.
At the time, no, I don't remember thinking of that. I was just thinking about the situation, to be honest with you. That's a good point. I wonder why I wasn't, but I guess they realized, hey, I'm in space, and this is kind of the inherent risk of doing it, whether it's from one event or just being there the whole time. Not something you dwell on. You kind of have to just compartmentalize and focus on the stuff that you can control. And in that situation, there's not much.
Yeah. You've also talked about finding the silver lining in the hardest times, and I wonder that's the same idea that we were just talking about, but is that a conscious thing? Do you sometimes say, this is difficult, let's go?
I think there's good in everything. You always, if you look hard enough, right, you might find it.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
Like what happened, what happened to me as well. Like, you come out of the other side and I can think of one bad thing that happened, but I can tell you 1,000 good things that happened afterwards. And
you got to just focus on the positives where you can find them. How were you injured?
Shelling. Okay. So we had some, the Russians just outside Kyiv, they were targeting our car, and we were in a small civilian car, and they hit the car, and the other four on the team died that day. And it was
I remember this happened.
We share something else in common, which is interesting. Your book is called Endurance: A Year in Space, A Lifetime of Discovery. Well, the one book, and that's based on the book about Shackleton and his trip, and the one book I read when I was in hospital that got me through was that book. It was about an adventurer, explorer, finding that strength in the hardest times that we've been talking about. And in what ways does that inspire you? And is that something that you keep thinking about?
Well, I actually brought Alfred Lansing's, there's a few versions of Shackleton's adventure.
Yeah, no, it's Lansing's, yeah.
Alfred Lansing's Endurance, Shackleton's Incredible Adventure. Which was written, I don't know, maybe like 30, 40 years ago. Shackleton also wrote his own book and was more of a diary that has a lot of detail. But on my first long duration flight, I had read the book before that, and then I took it with me because I felt like, the situation on board the space station, generally the living conditions aren't bad, but they could get bad. They could get really bad. And you might be stuck up there in a situation where maybe you're feeling sorry for yourself, or you're not happy. And I thought, the crew of Endurance were 28 people, left London in 1914, they left in September, arrived in Antarctica in January, got stuck in the ice 18 days later. Took them about 7 months drifting in the ice before they could get their lifeboats to the edge and eventually make it to Elephant Island and then finally South George Island. Over 2 years it took. And it was the most incredible story of leadership in a situation where it's hard to imagine that this was a true story. Actually, the first sentence of the book begins, "The story that follows is true." Because, I go on a cruise ship and it's like somebody always dies on the cruise ship. How is it possible not one of these people died on Shackleton's failure, actually? I mean, it was a failure of a mission, but it was one of the greatest leadership success stories of ever. So I brought this book with me. Actually, twice I brought it in space to read it. And it's one of the reasons I titled my own book, Endurance, in honor of Shackleton, but also I think my own story of being this like poor student, having a lot of perseverance and never giving up. And the fact that I went on this year-long, at the time, longest mission made sense to call my own book Endurance.
I almost called my book that came out last year Endurance as well. And then I saw the few other books like yours had been called it too. And I probably wasn't going to compete with your book, Scott.
You can't copyright a title.
That's true. There's another great book, by the way, about an Irish man who was on Shackleton's adventures too. And I can't remember his name, but it's fascinating. And he was like the workman of the group, and he became a hero in Ireland, but he was part of that group. And I wish I could remember the name on this podcast. I know, but a fascinating book that I'll send you the name of later. But all those guys, were amazing. You've talked also about how, you weren't a great student, and yet you went on to achieve great things. And I wonder what you would say to kids listening, or anyone listening, who thinks that, oh, maybe I'm not able to do that, or I haven't done that well at this point, but I can go on and I can do these things. Like, how would you send that message to them?
I was a kid that wasn't particularly motivated. I didn't do well in school. I mean, no one looked at me when I was younger, growing up, and thought, this guy's going to be an astronaut someday, right? No one thought that. I didn't think that. I never thought I could work for NASA, but I did. And for me, it was a matter of finding some inspiration, a spark for me that led me to believe that maybe I could actually do that. And I found it in another book. It was Tom Wolfe's book, The Right Stuff, which was about the original, fighter pilots, test pilots that became the original Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo astronauts. And I just recognized, I felt like, wow, I feel like I got the same spirit and skills and abilities of these guys, yet they all went to military schools or Ivy League schools and were scientists and engineers on top of being very accomplished pilots. But I thought, if I could just learn to do my homework, that's all I have to do. If I can do that, maybe I can go fly and, fly airplanes in the Navy someday. Maybe if not the Navy, maybe the Air Force, right? Generally easier. I think I made that joke already, but so I think for kids, what you need to do is find inspiration wherever you can find it. And it's out there. There's so many great things that you can do. I wish I could go back in time and start all over and have the ability to pick something extraordinary and work hard at it and be successful, because it's possible. Because I did it. I was, no one expected, including me, that I would ever become an astronaut someday. So
you wish you could go back because you think, there's something more amazing than what you've already done?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm not saying I would trade the experiences I had, but certainly, there's some other incredible things that I would have certainly have loved to have been involved with and do. Even in the military, I wasn't thinking that I would actually become an astronaut, even though I wanted to. So it's not something you should ever expect. And I think if you did, you're probably not the right type of person to have in that job. But yeah, I was very happy serving in the Navy. I wanted to someday be the CEO of an aircraft carrier, which I thought would be really great. Or there's just so many other opportunities out there if you know where to look and then how to get the skills to be competitive and successful.
More of our conversation right after this. You've called going to space the most rewarding thing in your life. And I wonder, talk about doing these amazing things. How does it feel to have come back a year in space? You've done something no one else has done. How does the future look after that, knowing that perhaps you have done the most incredible thing? How do you build on that? How do you set your goals for the future once you've done what probably is going to be the most amazing thing you've done?
Yeah. Well, there's other things you could do. I think it's amazing from if you're on the outside looking in, it's extraordinary. Even on the inside looking out, it's a pretty extraordinary experience. But it's not the most important thing people do, going to space. I think it's important to explore space, but we do other things that are important, more important. There are other things more important than flying in space that I've done. I think, the money I've raised for ambulances in Ukraine is and that have saved real people's lives. Me flying in space 4 times didn't save anybody's life. But those ambulances have, and that's significant. I try to do other things. Recently, took me 3 years. I was able to get this young Afghani girl, not so as young anymore, but she was a teenager. But to get her to the U.S., she reached out to me 3 years ago, and I was able to help her get a full ride scholarship to a U.S. college, a 4-year school, some support, financial support over here, and also help her with getting her student visa. So this was a girl that basically has been imprisoned for the last 3 years since the Taliban came in, and she wanted to be a scientist, an engineer, an athlete, and she was just basically imprisoned within her house by the Taliban, and now she's in school. Yeah.
Incredible. That's absolutely amazing. I didn't know that, actually. And I just think of 20 years in Afghanistan, where a whole generation of girls went to school. They were given a future. They told amazing things can happen. Overnight, that was taken away from them. And, we've worked out there a fair amount of times. We still know people in there. And so sad. Too many to save, no matter how many you try to help. Yeah. You mentioned Ukraine. I'd love to talk about that as well. You're a Goodwill ambassador. You focus on STEM education programs. You've raised $3 million. You've helped, aid Ukrainian medics. What drew you to that? I mean, of all the things you could have done and helped, why Ukraine? Why the war? What brought you to it?
A few things. I have some Ukrainian friends. I have a Ukrainian family member, niece and nephew that are Ukrainian Americans. My brother-in-law came from Ukraine when he was a teenager. My Russian language teacher is from Kharkiv. She's been a friend for over 20 years now. I can't believe it's been that long, but well over 20 years. But I'm also a big believer in freedom and democracy, and the idea that a country, European country, could attack a sovereign democracy, developing, but still, a country that used to be part of the, behind the Iron Curtain, and is now trying to become more westernized with freedom and, fair elections, and to have Russia just roll in there because, of Putin's ego, for lack of any other real reason. I mean, I think the bottom line is, he just wasn't happy having this smaller country outperforming his larger country right on his border. So he planned to destroy it, basically. So, that's why I wanted to do whatever I could to help the situation. And I've tried to do that in a number of ways, fundraising, also, a little bit at times, being a little bit aggressive on Twitter with some of the Russian Nachalniks. But there's all kinds of ways to help. And for me, it was to help Ukraine was critically important, because I think if we don't, we're going to be dealing with a larger problem later, not to mention the fact that this is genocide. I mean, he's trying to kill a population, and for people to, especially in this country that, supposedly we're supposed to stand up for freedom, and the fact that we have people that are on essentially the side of Russia in this, in the U.S. is just appalling to me.
I suppose it comes back. I don't know if it comes back to what we were saying at the beginning about the change in society, change in children. I mean, if you go back to the Cold War, you probably couldn't find barely a single person who didn't want to push back against the Russians, push back against communism, really defeat them. And again, it comes back to what's happened to society. How has that happened where somehow we don't think that you must stand up for them? And, you've been there. You were there quite early. You were there at the end of 22. Yeah. So, really at the beginning of the war, you went to Bucha. Total, massacres happened on there. Irpin. Why? Why is that? Why do you explain people in our country, in America, turning their backs on it? Do you have any idea?
I don't know. It's hard to understand, because we're supposed to, stand up against bullies and authoritarians and dictators, yet somehow, in certain demographic groups in this country, we've gotten completely, turned around on this kind of thing. And all of a sudden we have people in their government, in society, people that, have influence and a voice praising Vladimir Putin, who
and you
kills his, political opponents, murders people, murders children, bombs hospitals. It's hard to understand.
You've got quite an interesting view as well, because you've worked closely with the Russians. Your book was published in Russian. You've spoken about, and you're quite amazed at how amongst your Russian friends and former colleagues, most of them sort of seem to be against the war, but some who you considered educated are for the war.
So the people that I know that were for it and were defending it, I don't really talk to those folks anymore. I do know there's some cosmonauts that are opposed to it. It seems to me like a lot of them support it, but it's kind of hard to know whether genuine support, or is it the support that they feel like they need to show publicly to maintain their jobs as cosmonauts.
Or you end up in a prison camp up in Siberia.
Yeah. So I don't, on one hand, I fault them, but on the other hand, what would, in a similar situation, it's kind of hard to know what you would do yourself, right? You might just kind of stay quiet on the whole issue. I don't know. I like to think I wouldn't. I like to think be the cosmonaut version of Alexei Navalny, but maybe not. I don't know. You can't know until you've walked.
I think about that as well, and I wonder whether do Russians hold some blame for not being out on the streets? Should they be doing more to oppose their government? But then, if your family is going to lose you and you're going to go to prison, what do you do? And it's such an interesting divide. Do you think? I mean, listening to everything you've done and all your beliefs, you think you'd stand up on the streets at risk to your own safety with your voice?
I think I would, but I don't know for sure. When you're faced with that prospect of decades in prison for holding up a sign, do you think? Yeah, I would like to think I would do something more organized and thoughtful and maybe more effective. Maybe do it in a way that doesn't get you caught.
What do you think about space as well as sort of part of the geopolitical competition? Does it bring us together? Does it bring us apart? I mean, you work so closely with the Russians, and yet here we are on totally opposing sides.
Well, I think during the Cold War, it definitely worked to motivate us to get to the moon, right? We probably, without that geopolitical competition, I'd like to think we would have gotten to the moon. We probably wouldn't have gotten to the moon as fast as we did, because we were genuinely concerned that I think at some point we realized the Soviets weren't going to make it, but still the fact that they were moving towards a lunar lander motivated us to do that, get there first. We didn't want to be beat a second time. So that was definitely an influence. I think, China could very well, depending on their successes and what they do, motivate us further to expand or accelerate our own goals. And we participated with Russia now for decades on the International Space Station. And the idea, the genesis behind that was to kind of keep their scientists and their engineers engaged in something that was peaceful versus making weapons, particularly like, something that could deliver, ballistic missile technology and stuff like that you could use for, particularly for nuclear weapons. And it worked for a while, right? And now we're unfortunately in this partnership with a country that we can't trust, that we've lost most respect for. But we're in the situation where we have to continue to participate with them because of, how the space station was designed, decisions we made in the early development of the space station. But I can tell you, if it wasn't for that, design flaw, I guess you could call it, on the space station, we wouldn't be flying in space with the Russians any longer. And I don't see that happening again, with a government that's run by Putin, or someone, whoever comes after, unless it's a complete, change to their, to their government, where it's democracy and a country that's going to participate, peacefully and fairly with others on the world stage. We're not going to. I don't see any kind of cooperation in space happening with the Russians anytime soon.
Have you ever thought about getting into politics? I mean, you have such an idea about the country and where it should go and all the issues. And have you thought about it?
My brother does that. He does it. He does a pretty good job of it. I don't know if I want to.
But you talked about a lack of rivalry. But does that ever drive you? He's done it. Do you think you might go do it?
Yeah, I flew in space for a year, so he became a U.S. senator. He almost becomes the vice presidential nominee. I got to go do something. Nah, I don't know. If it made sense, we got two great senators. I live in Colorado. We got two great senators. We got a great governor. I would never say no. Like I wouldn't say I would never do it, but I'm not seriously thinking of doing it now. I see how tough of a job it is. I mean, what job do you have to, like in the case of my brother, raise $100 million twice, forced to get it, then to keep it. So you got to raise money to keep your job, and then you're working for people that half of them hate you. Even though you're trying to do what you think is best for them, they still hate you. And some of them want to actually kill you and will actually send you.
Seems as if getting elected, you sometimes have to sacrifice the things you believe in just to be elected, because you have to know what gets votes. And that seems like I didn't mean this whole podcast to talk about all the negatives. We talk about the future and resilience and all these things, but politics itself seems to have reached a point where that needs to change in a big way as well.
Yeah, I follow it pretty closely because, my brother's involved but it's just gotten so ugly and divisive. And yeah, it's sad.
Then to finish up with that in mind, with divisiveness and, kids not being driven and all these things and the world and countries being torn apart, what can you leave us with the sort of, where's the optimistic note? Where is the thing we got to focus on? Where do we find that power? How do we move forward and keep going in a strong way?
Well, we are, as far as we know, we're the smartest, most clever species that we know has ever existed in this universe. I mean, we went from flying airplanes in 1903 to landing two people on the moon in 1969 to, over $100 billion space station flying in space for over 20 years. Artificial intelligence, that capability is going to have profound impacts on us and our future. And I think, if you look at how we've evolved just in the last, 200 years as a species, with not physically, but with regards to our technology, imagine what the next 200 years is going to bring. Or 100 years or 50 years. It's incredible. I have a lot of hope that we can solve problems because we are smart. And we do have people that believe in science and engineering and facts versus opinion. We do have people in this country and around the world that want to work together and solve problems and, live in peace with your neighbors. So even though there's a lot of challenges out there, I think we can we can solve them. And I think, the future is bright if we want it to be. Yeah.
And I suppose rather than, maybe it starts with not just trying to achieve amazingly great, incredible things like you have, but just start with small things. Like, if everyone just went out and did something small, helped someone in a little way every day, like, gosh, wouldn't that change and improve where we stand? Yeah. Well, look, Scott, thank you so much for joining us. It was such a pleasure. And I know many people look to you and see what you've done. I know that inspires them. So I think that, you may not want to be an influencer, but I think you are one, and for a good reason. So thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for your sacrifice as a journalist. You guys put yourself in harm's way so often, and it's sorry to hear about your injury, but appreciate that you did it to keep us informed, which is one of the most important things, as we could see, living in the society we live in today. So thanks.
Telling the truth, making sure everyone knows the truth has got to be the first step towards anything. So it's worth the sacrifice at times. Yeah. Thanks so much, sir. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. You're listening to Searching for Heroes with Benjamin Hall. We'll be right back. Well, I think just speaking to Scott there, you got First of all, and I always thought astronauts have to be so clear-headed, and just listening to the way he described everything, listen to the way he laid things out, listen to the way he looked at preparation, just seems to be such a capable mind, and comes back to what he was saying about education, educating our kids. You know, you both have to be very intelligent and you have to find what you're going to do in life. But if you just find the one thing that inspires you on top of that, you can harness everything else. And I think lots of children, you know, going through school, growing up at the moment, maybe just need to be told that if they find that one thing, find something that inspires them, then they can grab onto that. So great pleasure to speak to him today. And read his book, Endurance, A Year in Space, A Lifetime of Discovery. He lays out in amazing depth what it's like to be in space and the thought process and what it was like. And I just think that you look at an astronaut and you have to think that that should inspire so many people. We must always be wanting, as he said, to try and do something different, do something new, keep pushing ourselves. And I guess I spoke about it last week when I talked about the Olympics and Olympic athletes as well. Those are the people that drive society. Those are the people that make things happen. They do it because they've got a drive. They do it because they believe in what they're doing. And once they've set their eyes on it, they go out and they do it. And even if you don't do it the first time, go and try it the second time. Just keep picking yourself up. So really inspirational. I'm very glad you joined us, and well, looking forward to next week as well. Everyone, I hope you're well. Take care. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcasts Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.